Hello and welcome to the Women Veterans Alliance Wednesday webinar. I am Melissa Washington. I am the CEO and founder of Women Veterans Alliance, and our primary mission is to connect women veterans with each other and resources. And one of the ways we do that is through our Wednesday webinar series that we have. If you've been to our site, which you should have went to our site to get registered for this webinar, we also do provide business and career coaching. We also have the only online directory for women veteran-owned businesses. We also have some great directories, including resources, as well as our allies directory. And our allies directory, these are organizations that predominantly serve women veterans. Also, too, we have a site with all the different women veteran memorials and monuments. And if you are not a member of Women Veterans Alliance, there's a lot of great benefits, and become a member today. And we also too have an online store as well. So next weekend, it's coming quick, is our Women Veterans Alliance. It's our unconference. This is our signature event. It will be our 7th one, and we have women veterans coming from all over the US. And there is still time if you can make it to Vegas next weekend. So we've finished up here our August lineup. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our wonderful presenter today. And I'm going to read her bio, and then I'm going to turn it over to her. So Dominiece Clifton is on a mission to guide others to rewrite their stories by releasing and reconnecting to remember their most authentic selves. A self-proclaimed stress-pert, registered yoga instructor, and trauma-informed breathwork and meditation facilitator, she is passionate about educating others on how to manage stress more efficiently and release trauma from their bodies. She promotes an integrated approach to healing that prioritizes emotional well-being for the mind, body, and spirit using somatic approaches. Today, she is the founder of Move and Still Nourish Wellness Collective, which is coming in 2023. It may already be here. I'm sure she'll tell us about it. And the host of the School of Healing podcast. She is a lifelong learner, speaker, and author. Her first book, Hold Space to Heal, will be released in the spring of 2023. I know this might be a little old bio, so again, I'm sure she'll give us some updates. When she isn't serving or learning, she enjoys making memories with her tribe. She is a wife, mother, daughter, sister, friend, and mentor. You can catch her dancing around the house with her daughters or indulging in her favorite form of soul care, curled up with a good book and soft jazz playing in the background. All right, Dominiece, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always interesting reading my bio. It sounds like a tongue twister a little bit. So thank you for that. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Dominiece Clifton, and I'm thrilled to be here with you all today to host this workshop and to offer some information which I hope will be helpful for you. I am located in Baltimore, Maryland, so I'm in the DMV area. I saw you all were dropping your locations, and someone was from DC. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to jump right in. Okay, let me make this bigger. All right, so I want to just make sure, just because right now we are dealing with Mercury in retrograde, that you all actually can see my screen. So if you can see my screen and you're on camera, just give me a thumbs up. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marge. You're one of the few that I can see. All right, so our topic for today, again, is mind-body freedom. And essentially what we're going to be diving deeper into is how we can begin to free our minds and bodies from the impact of stress and trauma. And I will say that, for us on the call, all being women, however we identify, we are most likely, or at some point in our lives, have dealt with a lot of stress, maybe trauma, and so this presentation is intended to provide some helpful feedback for how we can just manage and reduce the levels of stress and trauma in our lives. And so just a little bit of an overview. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because Melissa already gave me a wonderful introduction. Again, I am the founder of Move and Still, and our focus is really about offering trauma-informed wellness solutions to organizations. And so helping organizations with workplace wellness and community organizations with what it looks like to be more trauma-informed with the communities that they are working with the focus on holistic solutions, mindfulness, things of that nature. All right, so I always start my workshops out with what I call a mindful moment. And I do that because folks are coming from all different spaces and places. It's the middle or end of the workday, depending on what time zone you're on. And you might have been dealing with something just before you jumped on this Zoom call. And so, in order for you to be fully present with me for the next 50 minutes or so, I always just open up with a little bit of mindfulness just to help calm your body and your nervous system and to also ground you into this moment to give yourself permission just to be fully present. And so if you are okay with that, I'm going to invite you just to first get your posture ready. And so if you are sitting, we always start by sitting up nice and straight so that we have a nice straight spine. We sometimes sit and slouch, and so just go ahead and straighten your spine. You want to make sure that your feet are flat on the ground. If you are sitting in a chair, you can sit back just so that you feel the support of the chair behind your back. Place your hands, palms down on your thighs. And then the last thing is that you can close your eyes if that's comfortable, and if you are in a space where closing your eyes is okay. And if you can't fully close your eyes, that is totally fine. You can just relax your eyes by lowering them down so that you are not looking directly at the Zoom screen. And so either way, right now, I should not see any eyes looking directly at me. And so as you close your eyes or relax your eyes, I invite you to just draw your awareness into really bringing your five senses into this moment. So noticing my voice and maybe any other voices or sounds, noises that you hear around you, drawing your awareness to how the chair and the floor feels beneath your feet, beneath your thighs, just maybe noticing how the air feels on your skin, or if you're sitting outside, maybe noticing how the wind feels on your skin. Really just allowing yourself to come fully into the present moment. Oftentimes we are thinking about the past or already in the future, thinking about what we need to do. And again, this is just a really beautiful invitation to be present in this moment. And today we're going to do a belly breathing technique, which is a very simple technique. And so you can keep your palms on your thighs if that's comfortable, or you can connect with your body by placing one hand on your heart and one hand on your belly. And so what we're going to do is we're going to inhale through the nose, filling the belly like a big balloon. And then we're going to slowly exhale from the mouth as if you're blowing from a straw. And we're going to exhale for a slower count of 8. So again, we'll inhale through the nose for 4. We'll exhale through the mouth very slowly for 8. And I'll be guiding you this entire time. So when you're ready, go ahead and take a big breath in through the nose for a count of 4, 2, 3, 4. Slowly release from the mouth. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Once again, big breath in, filling the belly. 2, 3, 4, and slowly release. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We'll do 2 more of those together. Big breath in, filling the belly like a big balloon. 2, 3, 4, and release. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. For this last one, fill the belly, pull the air all the way up to the chest. Hold the breath. Just momentarily, once you inhale, hold the breath. And then go ahead and slowly release from the mouth for the last time. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And once you finish exhaling on that last release, you can return to a natural breathing pattern and just take a moment to notice how your body feels in this moment. Notice if there are any emotions that are coming up for you now that you've given yourself permission to be still for a moment. Noticing anything that comes up without judgment. Once again, tuning into your senses as you bring your awareness back fully into your body. Noticing what you hear, feel, maybe smell. And then you can slowly begin to wiggle your fingers and your toes. And if you did close your eyes, you can slowly begin to blink them open, bringing yourself back fully into your space. And then when you're ready, bringing your eyes back to the Zoom screen. All right. So if you are open to sharing how that was, feel free to drop it in the chat. The practice that we did again was called the belly breath, and that is really just really engaging the diaphragm fully. So inhaling into the belly, a lot of times when we are stressed, we typically breathe very shallowly, a lot quicker. And so this is an easy practice that you can turn to at any point just to ground your body, just to relax and restore your body. And the beautiful thing about this practice is that it's super simple, but it really encourages the use of full oxygen flowing through the body, which is a great way to trigger the parasympathetic nervous system, which we'll talk about a little bit today, again, to calm the body. All right, so we have 3 objectives or 3 goals that we're going to be focused on for today's session. The first one is that I want to really help you all to increase your understanding and awareness of stress and trauma and how they impact the mind and body. So when we are under a lot of stress, when we are dealing with a lot of traumatic situations, how does that show up in our bodies? How do our bodies communicate to us that something is wrong? We're also going to look at the stress response cycle and talk about ways that we can complete the cycle. And then finally, I want to give you some strategies that you can use on a consistent basis to help with emotional regulation and just really continuing to reduce stress in your day-to-day life, whether it's on a personal and professional basis. So jumping into that first objective, which is focused on increasing awareness of stress and trauma and the way that they impact the mind and body, I want you all to take a moment and just think about the last time that you were stressed. This could be today before you came here on this call. It could have been yesterday, it could have been last week or last month. Really just pinpoint one specific time in your mind that something stressful happened in your life. And I'm not going to ask you to share whatever that stressful moment was, but I do want you to think about the emotions that came up for you when you were dealing with that stressful moment. So what emotions came up? And then how did you show up? So when you're stressed out, how do you show up in the world? Whether that's to your family members, your colleagues, how do you show up in the world? And then once you've identified that moment, that stressful moment, and identified those emotions, go ahead and drop in the chat, just again, those emotions, and maybe talk about the ways that you show up and how that might look different personality-wise or energetically than when you are not feeling stressed and overwhelmed. And I'll just pause for a moment here just to give you all a minute to think, process, and then drop your responses in the chat. Okay, so Donna Lou, thank you for sharing that you, as far as emotions go, you feel anxiety and then it causes you to binge eat. And I can totally relate to that because I spent a lot of my life having an unhealthy relationship with food as well. And that was one of the ways that I used to cope. Thank you for being transparent with your response. Anyone else? Anger, yeah, that's a big one. Again, what emotions came up for you when you think about that stressful time? How do you show up in the world? So how do you respond to the people around you? Maybe how do you respond to yourself? Sometimes we turn those feelings inward towards ourselves. Give it about 10 more seconds. Nervous, okay. Thank you, Bernice. Awesome. I shake more, I can't think straight, there's anger, there's fear. Yeah. So we can see that when we experience stress and trauma, oh, hang on one second. Going through a lot of stress. My dad just had a stroke. I'm sorry to hear about your dad. Process of looking for a job for the past 2 weeks. So very angry and stressed. You don't really have ways to cope. Thank you, Terry, for sharing so vulnerably and transparently with us. I want to just honor your comment and also hope that by the end of this session, you do have a couple of ways to help you cope. So we have a range of different emotions that show up when we are feeling stressed, and it causes us to all show up in different ways. And the reason that I ask this question is because a lot of times we can be disconnected from our body just based on our own past experiences or our own trauma. And we oftentimes don't notice our levels of stress, the level of burnout that we're dealing, or the levels of stress that we are dealing with until we get to the point of burnout. And so I always just ask people to think about like how your body feels, how you show up, because it helps you to begin to bring awareness to the fact that, hey, I'm stressed and I might need to slow down, or I might need to think about a healthy way to, to reduce my stress levels. So thank you all for sharing. So before we go any further, I just want to look at defining stress so that we're all on the same page. Of course, we're all familiar with what stress is. So stress can be emotional. So you all have just shared some of the emotions that you experience. It can be mental or physical tension that occurs when the demands that are placed on us are essentially greater than we can handle. So it's kind of an imbalance. You have all of these demands, and then your ability to cope is down here. And when that happens and there's not that balance of the two, you can deal with stress, you can deal with burnout. Essentially, stress is the way that our body responds. So when we are triggered, certain things happen in the body, and stress is really the way that our body responds to those triggers. Those triggers can be people, family members, colleagues. It can be harmful events or something that, we see, we hear, but it can also be internal thoughts. Our own internal thoughts can cause us to stress. So worrying about something that hasn't happened but might happen is an example of like an internal thought. And then another thing that's important about stress is that not all stress is created equally, which we're going to look at in a second. But essentially, again, stress is the way that the body responds to a trigger, whether it's emotional, mental, or physical. So we have different types of stress. A lot of times when we think about stress, we think about just negative stress, but stress is also intended to be helpful for us. So we have good stress or eustress, which is kind of like our hero that comes in to save the day when we need to get something done. So when we're dealing with a good level of stress, it helps to sharpen our attention. It helps us to be more energetic and be more alert. I will give you an example right now of how eustress is showing up for me. I did not sleep well last night. I was feeling very tired before getting on this webinar, but all of a sudden my adrenaline has kicked in to help me get through this next hour. That's really good. So now I have the energy that I need to push through this webinar and show up as best as I can for you all. And some examples of that outside of my own example is things like getting a new job, right? Like it's stressful as you're applying for the new job or filling out the resumes and filling out the applications, but it's good stress because it's helping you to move forward and progress in your life. Maybe starting a new job, folks that are applying for colleges, buying a new car, there's all sorts of things, moving. So these things are things that are typically exciting for us and typically helpful for us. These are ways that stress shows up to, again, help us to be more productive, energetic, and alert. And then, of course, the opposite of that is bad stress or distress. And this is essentially what most of us are used to and what most of us are dealing with. So this is stress that is prolonged. It's stress that we're experiencing every day. Unfortunately, in the modern world that we live in, many of us experience stress every day, multiple times a day. The challenge with stress that we experience every day is that at some point, our body, it doesn't get the chance to recover the way that it needs to, and this stress goes from being good for us to being really bad for us, and it starts to damage our bodies, and we're going to look at that a bit today. It damages our bodies, it impacts our mood, it can impact our performance. Oftentimes it shows up in our relationships with other people, which is why I asked you guys when you are stressed, like how do you show up in the world? Because over time, when we're dealing with prolonged stress on a consistent basis or a daily basis, it does begin to impact the relations around us. And then again, some examples of distress or negative stress are things like living in a stressful environment. So there might be emotional abuse or, something going on, or you're in an environment with a roommate who makes you uncomfortable or a family member who, has overstayed their welcome. I've had things like that happen. You can be working in a stressful work environment that's really toxic. Simple things, like getting stuck in traffic jams or living in a city where there's a lot of traffic and you commute back and forth can be stressful. Of course, things like bills and just trying to get through life financially. So these are all examples of bad stress. And when we deal with these things on a constant basis, we might be having multiple stressors happening at one time. Over time, this really begins to impact our body and then again, the ways that we show up in the world. And so again, I'm going to be asking you all a lot through this presentation to just share your thoughts in the chat. Just because I don't want to be speaking at you for the next hour, I really want to pull you into this so that you can think about your own experiences and how they relate to today's topic. So pausing and thinking about just some of the things that cause you to stress out. Again, not going to ask you to share those in the chat because that can be very personal, but I do want to just take 15 seconds. I'm going to pause and I just want you to think about when I ask you to think about things that cause you to stress, what are the things that come top of mind for you? Like, what are the things that immediately pop in your head? And I will pause and you can think, you can reflect. If it's easy, you can write it down, whatever is easier for you. All right. So hanging on to these things, whatever you thought about, those are all stressors. So we have stress and then we have stressors. again, stress is how our bodies respond to the stressors. So when something happens that causes us to stress, it could have been a person, it could have been an event, it could have been a thought. Those are considered stressors. And the reason why I'm defining these things is once we get to the stress response cycle, you'll see that how you deal with these is a little bit, well, not a little bit, it's very different. A stressor, again, can be a situation. What happens is you deal with the stressor. Let's just say, for example, I'm a mom of two little ones. So I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. When I think about my stressors, they're at the top of my list, not because I don't love them, but because they are 3 and 6. And for anyone who's a mom or has raised children, you know that that's a very tumultuous age and the emotions are quite ranging. I see some head nods here. As dearly as I love them, they can be very stressful at times. And so that's an example of a stressor. When I experience that trigger, my body responds in certain ways to that, whether it's anger, which we talked about, whether it's, shutting down because I'm exhausted. Like there's different ways that my body responds, but they are just one of the stressors, right? So here's the thing. When you think about your stress and when you think about your stressors, the two are completely different, and how we handle and manage them is very different. So how you treat the stress in your physical body is going to be completely different from how you manage those stressors, how you manage those triggers. So to give you some examples, managing your stressors might look like clocking out at the end of a workday if you work a very stressful job and going home. Great, now you're not in that stressful environment anymore. If you're working in a job that's really toxic and stressful, it might look like just seeking new employment to get out of that job, that environment that's constantly stressful. Great, now you're out of that environment. You're not dealing with that stressor anymore. And let's just say that if you have a relationship that is not serving you or that you feel like can be very stressful, whether that's a family member, friend, or colleague, when you establish some boundaries with that person or, those people, that is a way to manage the stressors. It's important to remember that how we deal with our stressors doesn't do anything to treat the stress levels. And so this is one of the key things that I want you all to take away from this webinar today. Sometimes we think that just because we've gotten a new job or just because we're no longer dealing with, the toxic relationship or we put boundaries up, we think that that takes care of the stress. That doesn't. That just eliminates the stressor. So to deal with the stress, which is again the physical body and the way that the body responds, you have to complete the stress cycle, which we're going to go into and talk about. So how you treat your stress, your body, and how you treat the stressor, the trigger, two different things. All right. And don't worry, I mentioned the stress response cycle. We will come back to that in a moment just to kind of bring everything home. So shifting to think about trauma, which is similar to stress, but also kind of fits into its own bucket. I'm curious as to when you all hear the word trauma, what comes to mind, whether it's a specific word or specific phrases or specific incidents, what sort of things pop into your head when you hear the word trauma? And again, you can drop your responses into the chat, and I'm keeping an eye on that just to read those and share. War, yep. PTSD, experiences, bad childhood, yep, I can relate to some of those. Trauma, something more than I have ever felt, okay. Being attacked, yeah. Physical injury, war, okay. Thank you all for sharing. Just honoring all of the comments. And I see that there were some stressors that were shared earlier that I missed, but I am looking over those now. Emotional injury, yeah. So as you can see, just like stress, there's a range of different, thoughts, experiences, emotions that pop up when we think about trauma and the definition of trauma. And so again, I just want to center this conversation with providing a definition of what trauma is. Gloria, I also saw your response, childhood and Army. Yes, very true. So trauma, oftentimes when we think about trauma, and I saw some of these responses dropped into the chat, we think about things like war veterans, which all of you are. We think about maybe PTSD. We think about things like sexual abuse victims. We might even think about survivors of a devastating natural disaster. So we might think about, a tsunami or 9/11. Like typically we think about very drastic situations when we think about trauma. But the reality is that trauma impacts all of our lives. In some way or another, we all have dealt with some form of trauma. We've either witnessed it firsthand. So I saw some of you dropping in the chat, childhood trauma, which was for me, one of the greatest things that I had to work on healing from. It could have been emotional trauma from adulthood. There's a ton of different ways that we can experience trauma for ourselves, but we can also witness trauma from other people. And so to give you an example of that, whenever we scroll social media and there's some new shooting that has happened in this country, or some new, something tragic that has happened in this country, even though that hasn't happened to us directly, that is traumatic for us. To take in that information, that's traumatic for us. And typically our minds, our bodies respond to that trauma. So whether we're hearing it on the news or we're scrolling social media, that is an example of witnessing trauma. And then in the day and age that we live in, unfortunately, there's literally sometimes where, whether it's the news or social media, that we see actual footage, because everyone now has a camera and they're quick to pull it out when something is happening. And so a lot of times we're witnessing actual footage of someone, a traumatic experience, someone being hurt or harmed, or something happening that is harmful. So again, trauma impacts all of our lives. It's not just folks who've been in war, like, many of you are veterans. It's not just a sexual abuse survivor. It's our day-to-day experiences living in this world that we live in. So the word trauma actually stems from the Greek word wound. And so when we think about trauma in its original form, it was used just to describe physical wounds. But today we know that trauma extends past just physical wounds. Trauma includes the mental process that we go through, or the psychological process. Trauma can also impact us on an emotional level. So you might have experienced emotional abuse. That's not something physical, but that could have greatly impacted you. So it's not just physical in its description anymore. The thing about trauma is that, just like stress, it impacts the way that we function. So it impacts how we cope, how we deal. It impacts our behavior and how we show up in the world. It often impacts our habits and how we, again, how we cope with things, whether it's a healthy way or unhealthy way. And it also informs our ways of thinking. And so I like to give the example of, when you've experienced trauma, you begin to see the world from a different lens. It's almost like you put on some colored glasses, and everything that you see through those glasses are going to reflect the color of those glasses. That's the same thing with trauma. So if you had a very traumatic experience, the way that you see the world is going to be altered, which is obviously going to alter the way that you move and show up in the world. So there are types of trauma, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the types of trauma, but I did want to go over some of the ways that we can experience trauma. So trauma can be inherited. So we can actually trauma can be passed down through generations. And so let's say I will, give an example. If a mother is pregnant with a fetus and she's dealing with a very traumatic or stressful situation, and there's a lot of fear, stress, worry while she's pregnant, all of those emotions are being secreted to that fetus, that child that is unborn. And so when that child comes into the world, even though they're just getting into the world, their bodies now have an experience of trauma. Their bodies have received those stress hormones that the mother was experiencing, and that can impact the ways that they show up as an infant. That can impact, their lives as they get older. And so sometimes, even though they might not be able to process or remember a specific experience, they can still be dealing with the emotions of that experience. Again, thinking about myself as a Black woman, or indigenous cultures here, like there's generational trauma that we can see from enslavement up until now that continues to impact certain cultures, genocide, things of that nature. So again, trauma doesn't necessarily have to be your own experience to impact you directly when you think about generations. And then there's developmental trauma. So again, in the chat, I saw some responses about childhood trauma. That's essentially what that is. It's the way that trauma impacts us as children. And if we do experience traumatic situations as children, it can impact brain development, and then that impacts obviously the way that we show up as adults. And a lot of times what happens is, you experience trauma as a child, there are gaps or needs that you have that are left unfulfilled, and as you grow up, you age physically, but emotionally, maybe mentally, your emotions are still functioning on a lower level, because you have unmet needs that create gaps in your brain. And so you might show up angry, you might over respond to things, and people might not understand why you are showing up a certain way. Your body is just going back to what it's familiar with from things that happened in your past. And then, of course, we have collective trauma. And just an easy example of this is us all being here 3 years after COVID. That was something that we experienced on a global basis. That's an example of collective trauma, something that impacts us on a mass scale. And then the last one is race-based stress and trauma. And especially in this country, no matter what your skin color, ethnicity, race is, in some way or another, we all have at some point experienced some sorts of race-based stress and trauma. All right. So now that we've talked about trauma, now that we've talked about stress and defined all of those things, again, going back to the question that I asked you when we first jumped on this webinar today, go back to that stressful situation that you thought about. So I asked you about the emotions that came up. So now bring that stressful situation, that thought back into your head. And now I'm going to ask you a different question, because now we're going to focus on the body. When you think about that stressful situation, how did you feel? Where did you feel that stress in your body? So what physical symptoms did you notice? So just to give you an example, you might have noticed a headache or like your muscles tensing up. Again, thinking about the thing that happened to you, I'm going to give you about 15 seconds just to think about your body, and then you can drop those responses in the chat as well. Okay, so feeling the stress in her stomach. Thank you, Bernice, for that. Increased heart rate. Yep, that's a common one. Any other thoughts? Rapid thought. Lack of sleep is a big one for me as well, Donna Lou. Punch in the gut. Yeah. So a lot of feeling emotions in the gut. Chest tightness, some headaches, breathlessness, heart racing. So we're seeing some patterns here with heart racing and tightness, lack of sleep. That's come up a few times. Tension in the shoulders is a huge one, and the pelvis. Yes. So Terry, you said something. We hold most of our stress in our shoulders and in our hips. And so it makes sense that you will feel that tension in your shoulders and your pelvis. Wonderful. So not wonderful that we feel these things, but wonderful that you all have participated and share your experiences. So again, when we experience stress, it happens in our bodies, right? And so the reason, again, for asking that question is, how can we begin to draw more awareness to the ways that our bodies respond? And so going back to the responses that you all dropped into the chat, for example, Terry's responses, are you slowing down enough? And I'm not asking this to you specifically, Terry, but just using it as an example. Like, are you aware of your body enough? Are you slowing down enough to know that when your body feels tight, when you feel that tension in your shoulders or maybe your pelvis, are you slowing down to honor your body? Or like a lot of us do, are you just continuing to push through because there are things that need to get done? And then you ignore, I see some head nodding, and then you ignore the signals until your body forces you to sit down. There are many ways that your body might force you to sit down. It might be an illness. It might be, something that comes up. It could be a lot of different things. It might be a headache. Like, I know for me, if I've gone too many days without getting adequate sleep and I'm just trying to get through, I'll eventually get a headache, and it's like, okay, now I have to rest. And so that's an example of me not honoring the fact that I need rest because I have so many things to do. And then eventually my body forces me to shut down and to listen. So essentially, all of the things that you all listed in the chat are the ways that our bodies communicate to us. They're constantly talking to us. They're constantly letting us know when, we're feeling stressed, when we're dealing with overwhelm. But a lot of times we don't listen. A lot of times we kind of suppress that voice and push it out of the way. So now let's take a moment to look at the body. So I'm not going to go through all of this. I know this is a pretty intense diagram, but I did want to draw awareness to two things. So we have our central nervous system, which is essentially the way that our brains communicate to our bodies. That's the easiest way to describe it. There's all these different things that the brain is responsible for. When something happens, the brain is responsible for telling the body how to respond. If you look over here at the two green and blue circles, you see the sympathetic nervous system or sympathetic division, and then you see the parasympathetic. This is really what I want to draw your awareness to. So when you're in the sympathetic, you have the fight or flight response. You all most likely are familiar with this at some point in your life. You've heard about it. So the fight or flight or fight, flight, freeze response is what happens when you experience stress. You typically have one of these ways that you respond. And so fight might be the person that gets angry and is ready to, get into an argument with the spouse or yell at the kids. Like, that's your typical stress response. Someone else might be on the flight side. And so when something happens, they retreat and maybe they just want to hide under the covers. Like, these are different ways or habits that our bodies have learned that, okay, this feels safe for me, or this helps me, and this is my go-to response. On the opposite side of that, we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest, or I like to say rest and restore. Because when our bodies turn on or slip into that parasympathetic state, it gives our bodies the time to restore from being in that sympathetic or fight or flight response. And so going back to starting with that mindful moment at the beginning of this webinar, that's an example of the power of just taking a few breaths, and how being intentional about just pausing for a moment and deep breathing, it switches on the parasympathetic nervous system, which tells your body that it's safe, and it gives your body permission to begin restoring and doing some of the things that it needs to do if you've been under a lot of stress. So our bodies and brains respond a lot of different ways when it comes to stress. We all have the amygdala, which is like this little pea-sized thing in our brain, but it has so much power. The amygdala is what is in control of the fight or flight response. This is necessary for survival. We don't have to do anything, it just happens automatically. So, if right now, let's just say theoretically, a big lion just like ran into my space out of nowhere and you all saw it on your Zoom screen, obviously I would be impacted by that and my body would respond by me getting up and running or, trying to protect myself. But each of you would also respond to that. Like your bodies would also do something because you're seeing this drastic thing happen, and you would go into a fight or flight response, or you would feel your heart rate start to increase and all of those things. So the wonderful thing about the brain is that we don't have to think about it. There are certain things that happen automatically. If I had to process the lion that came into the room and then try to think about what I'm going to do, I would probably get eaten. The wonderful thing about the amygdala is that it works really fast, and it just switches on that fight or flight response, and it's helpful for survival. The challenge is that because we are living in times with so many modern day stressors, our amygdala, that fight or flight response, is constantly being activated. So maybe there's no lion that's coming into the room. Maybe it's just traffic. Maybe it's just emails. Maybe it's just children. Maybe it's just the partner. Maybe it's just finances. But imagine how many times a day that you incur a stressful situation, or how many times a week you incur a stressful situation, and your amygdala automatically goes into fight or flight, right? So again, it's necessary for survival, and it was great for us thousands of years ago when we roamed the earth with saber-toothed tigers and had to stay alive. It's not so great now in our modern worlds with our modern stressors, because every day our amygdala is constantly being triggered. All right, so we have our amygdala, which I've talked about extensively, and then we have the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of like our thinking brain, which is up here. So the prefrontal cortex is a more recent part of our brain development. We've always had the amygdala because we've always needed it to survive. We haven't always been able to talk and think logically. That's more of a more recent part of brain development. Here's the thing, and the reason why this is important. When we experience stress, blood rushes away from the thinking brain, so away from this logic and reasoning, and it goes to the amygdala, because again, the brain wants to keep us alive. It wants to keep us safe. This becomes problematic in our modern day world because when we experience stress, it shuts down the thinking brain. It shuts down the logical brain. So I always give the example, if you've ever gotten into an argument with someone, and I think a partner or a relationship like a significant other is a great example. If you've ever gotten into an argument with someone and have said really, mean or hurtful things, or things that you go back and think about later and you're like, why did I say that? In that moment, because you are under a stressful situation, the logical brain is not turned on. So you're not thinking through things. You're not able to process what you're going to say. You're kind of just blurting things out because you feel threatened. And now your body is in a space of, I need to be safe. And so I've had that happen to me a ton of times. And then I sit and I think about things, and I don't understand why I said the thing that I said, or why I reacted the way that I reacted in that stressful situation. But that's because my logical brain was shut off. And so this is important to note, because it doesn't just impact our relationships, but think about if you're stressed out on a consistent basis and you're trying to be productive and work and get things done. If you're stressed, if you're burned out, it's really hard to show up and function in your greatest capacity, because your thinking brain, your logical brain, is not really functioning at its greatest and fullest capacity. All right. So we've talked about the brain. We're going to look at the body just a little bit. So again, you understand the way that the body works. So when you experience stress, the brain tells the body, send these hormones down to the body so that so that the body can respond and save you. So you experience stress and you have cortisol that goes rushing through your veins, and adrenaline. When you all mention that your heart starts to beat faster when you're feeling stressed, or your muscles tense, that's because those stress hormones are flowing throughout the body. So the heart beating faster is one of the greatest examples of adrenaline rushing through the body. What happens is the body's getting ready to prepare for fight or flight. Again, our brain is super outdated and it thinks that everything is survival, right? So it goes into automatically, I need to protect my human. Some of the physical symptoms that you experience, and you all have shared most of these, are, increased heart rate. So the heart starts to beat faster. You might start to breathe quicker. You might notice that the muscles tense up. You also are going to have a greater supply of blood that's running through the body, which is going to increase your blood pressure, right? So it's going to cause the blood pressure to rise. And then the senses are also sharpened. Now, this is great if you are running from something that is dangerous to you, or if you're in a situation where you're being attacked and you need to protect yourself. This is not so great when you're stuck in traffic and all of these things are happening. And this is the reality that we're living in today. Our bodies are responding on a survival basis, but many of the things that we are experiencing are not survival situations. The other thing that happens that's really important to note is that the body also shuts down certain functions to prioritize other functions. So if you think about survival, what needs to happen if you're, like if you're in a situation where you need to get away or flee something? You need to run faster, you need to breathe differently, your muscles are going to tense up, your body's going to send blood to the legs so that you can run faster, things of that nature. Digestion is going to be impacted. So you don't need to be digesting food right now. You need to be running to stay alive. And so your digestion is going to slow down, your immune function weakens, your growth and repair. So if you have a damage or a cut or something, like all of those things stop. Your body is not focused on repairing or growing anything. It's focused on survival. Another big one is that reproductive functioning changes. And so your body, again, is not in a space where it can be thinking about producing or carrying a baby or anything of that nature, creating life. That slows down. And your body might also store weight. And now the reason why I share all of these things is I want you to think about what happens long term if all of these things are happening. So what happens long term if your blood pressure is constantly increasing because of stress? What happens long term if your heart rate is constantly increasing because of stress? What are the side effects of digestion slowing down? Maybe something like constipation or, some other stomach related or gut related illness. What happens if your immune system begins to weaken? You're wondering why you're constantly getting sick. You get over one thing and then there's something else. I've had people tell me that, like, I'm constantly, catching a cold, or I've had COVID X amount of times. That's because your immune system is constantly putting out fires. And so it's not able to repair and really be on guard for you in the way that it's supposed to be. Your immune system is like your little army. And so just imagine, or I like to think about it maybe like a fire department. What happens? You get a call, the fire department gets a call, it goes to put the fire out. And then in general, the firemen are supposed to come back and they're supposed to rest and be able to recuperate. But if there's fire after fire after fire after fire after fire, they can't get to all the fires, they're burned out, and they're not showing up at their greatest capacity. If you think about your immune system that same way, if you are constantly dealing with stress and triggers, your army, your firemen, they are depleted. They are not able to show up for you. And then another one is that oftentimes women who are dealing with stressful situations have issues with reproduction. That's a really big one. Again, your body is not in a space where it is thinking about carrying or creating life. It is so stressed, it's thinking about keeping you safe. And so these are all of the long-term implications, is that the word, that can happen when you're dealing with a lot of stress. Okay. That was a lot. I just want to pause here for a second. We've gone through that first objective, which was about just, defining stress and trauma, really looking at the ways that it defines the body. Any questions on this before I move forward? You can drop them in the chat, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I see your chat, Donaloo. So I am not sure about how antidepressants and anti-anxiety medicine affect the amygdala. That would probably be a great question to ask your doctor. I'm not sure, as far as the brain response, if those meds slow down that brain response in any way. But that's a great question, and that's the first time I've gotten that question, so I'll also look into that myself. Okay, so if there are no more questions from that first part, which is the lengthiest part, I'll continue moving forward. So our second objective is probably one of the most important pieces of this presentation. We're going to dive into the stress response cycle and how you can complete the cycle. So when I first learned about this was a game changer for my life and the way that I manage my own personal stress. Our bodies all have a stress response cycle. And many of us don't know this because it's not something that we're taught. Stress is intended to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So if you think about the beginning, it's how you're feeling right now for the most part. You're comfortable, you're stable, you feel safe. That's homeostasis. Your body is in balance. Let's say you're just walking down the street or you're on your favorite hiking trail and you're feeling calm, cool, and collective. Let's say a dog runs out and you don't see the owner, the dog isn't on a leash, and it starts barking and chasing you. All of a sudden now you go from being in that calm state to immediately, again, survival alarm phase, right? So now we're in the middle. So we're running. This is our response to the stressor. We're trying to get out of the way. We're trying to not get bitten by the dog that, is out of nowhere attacking us. Now you're in the middle. Let's just say you run fast enough where you get away from the dog, or you make it to your car and you get in the car and then you're safe from the dog. Great. Here's the thing. Most of us will drive off. We'll go about our day. We'll call someone and tell them how crazy it was that we just got chased by a dog, but that's it. We won't do anything to signal to our bodies that it's safe so that it can stop releasing chemicals and hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. What is supposed to happen is that you're supposed to do something to help your body to recover, to rebuild, to restore. That's the end. When you constantly are experiencing stress and you don't complete the cycle, you get stuck in the middle, right? And so what we don't realize is that we can be walking around with days, weeks, years, decades of unresolved stress response cycles, and our bodies can still be holding all of that. So that's really important to note. You can have something that happened a month ago that your body can still be holding on to because you never did anything to signal to your body that it's safe so that it can recover. And so the important thing to remember about this is that the stress response cycle has to be completed. So if you just eliminate the stressor, that's not enough. If you just go home after a stressful workday, that's not enough. Great, you're not in that environment anymore, but your body doesn't know that it's safe. Your body doesn't know that, I need to start signaling and recovering because you haven't done anything to signal to your body. So you have to do things. You have to communicate to your body the way that it communicates to you so that your body will stop releasing chemicals, stop secreting hormones, and go back to a space of relaxation. And I'm going to give you a couple of ways that you can do that. But again, I want to go back to that breathwork practice that we did at the beginning, because deep breathing is one of the most efficient, but it's also one of the simplest ways to help with completing the stress response cycle, telling your body that it's safe. All right. So once you are working through and you're being intentional about completing your cycle, how do you know? How do you know when the body is calm? How do you know when you are restored? And even think about that for yourself. Like when you are feeling better after dealing with stress, how does your body feel? How does it change to tell you that it's feeling better? It's going to tell you because our bodies are always communicating to us. It's the same as knowing that you're full when you eat a meal, right? Like no one has to tell you you're full. You just know. It's this intuitive shift in your body where your mood changes. And so maybe now you're feeling a bit more positive. You might feel a release in the physical tension. So again, someone mentioned feeling the tension in your shoulders. When you completed the cycle, maybe you feel less tension or no tension, right? Maybe your thoughts begin to calm down if you've been dealing with a lot of worry. Feeling relaxation in your muscles, your breathing changes and it slows down. These are all the ways that our bodies communicate to us that it's completed the cycle. Now, here's the thing. The more that you begin to be intentional about completing your stress response cycle, the easier that it's going to be to complete the cycle, and the easier that it's going to be to recognize when you need to do something to help alleviate the stress. So I've been very diligent about prioritizing my body every single day and doing things to make sure that I release stress. I can feel when I'm getting stressed a lot quicker. So I'm not going to say I never, but I typically can catch myself before I get to the state of burnout because I know what it feels like when I'm getting there. So the minute that I start to feel the tension in my neck or the tension in my shoulders or just the emotional fatigue, I will pause and take a break and do something for my body because my body is telling me, hey, you're getting to the point where you're going to burn out. So it's about building a relationship with your body. Another important thing to note here is that if you've never done anything to release stress or you haven't done things intentionally to release stress, you might not feel relaxation right away. And so let's say you hear this webinar and you're like, okay, great, I'm going to work on completing my stress cycle. And then you sign up for one yoga class. And then you finish and you're like, oh, I still feel really stressed out and I still feel tight and tense. And then you go back to not doing anything because you think it doesn't work. The thing is, if you've spent years, decades, however long building up stress it's going to take more than one yoga class. It's going to take more than one, breathwork session. So you got to be patient with your body and give yourself grace, because your body is working on completing a lot of incomplete cycles. And so just keep at it. That's the whole point here. Now, here are a few tips when it comes to prioritizing self-care, because we're all really, really busy in our own ways. We're all dealing with and managing a lot of things. You experience stress every single day. The stress might look different from day to day, but every day there's something, at least one thing that happens that causes us to stress out. So that means that in the perfect world, you should be doing things every day to complete your stress response cycle, to get yourself through that cycle so that your body recovers. I always tell people that you have to make it a priority, like your life depends on it, because it does. So schedule it into your day, put it on your calendar. For those like me who literally live by their calendars, it's really good to schedule in midday or end of day or beginning of the day. Put something on your calendar for yourself, even if it's just 10 minutes and that's all that you have and that you can start with. And then you also have to experiment and find what works. So I'm going to give you a couple of techniques before we get off of the webinar today. But you might try something and you might not like it. And so that means, okay, let me try something else. You also have to think about different strategies for different days. So as an example, you might not have time every single day to go and do a 60-minute yoga class, but you might be able to breathe for 2 minutes, right? During the week, Monday through Friday. And then maybe your yoga class is your indulgence, self-care on the weekend. And so you have to experiment with what works for you and what works for your schedule. Some strategies are just not practical for day-to-day basis, and that's okay. But you do want to make sure that you find something that you can do every single day. Okay. Any questions there just about the stress response cycle, about completing the cycle, about why it's important to go through and to recover, and why it's important to do it every day? Any questions about that? Because I know for many that's a new concept. And so if there's anything that you're unsure about or unclear about, feel free to drop it in the chat and I will do my best to answer. All right. All hearts and minds are clear. Let's get through our last objective, which is probably the most important part. I'm going to give you a couple of strategies that help to complete the cycle, that help to reduce stress, and really help you to begin to regulate your body so that you are, again, you're more aware and more in tune with your body so that you can recognize when it's feeling stressed a lot sooner. So this is not an all-encompassing list, but these are the go-to or my favorite places to start. So when it comes to completing the cycle, when it comes to releasing stress, preventing yourself from getting to the space of burnout, these are some of the most effective ways to do that. And so if you want to take a picture or jot them down, whatever you want to do, go ahead and do that now. Physical movement is the number one way. It's the most efficient way to release stress from the body. This is any sort of physical movement. It can be going for a walk, walking the dog, walking with a friend or partner. It can be going for a swim, Zumba, yoga, going to the gym, whatever your thing is, there's nothing that's off limits here. Even going for a hike on the weekend, these are all examples of physical movement. The goal is just to get the body moving, and that's the most efficient way to release stress. Also, mindfulness as a practice. So again, we opened up with a little bit of breath work and just, grounding ourselves. That's a really helpful way. Breath work, meditation. Getting out in nature or ecotherapy is really helpful. For those that enjoy being outside, you will probably find that you go outside and it helps you to feel more grounded. So sometimes I like to just go outside and be around nature. I'm a water baby, and so being around water and listening to the sound of water is really helpful and soothing for me. Or if I'm in a pinch, I will just go outside when the weather permits and just place my feet on the grass, because that is also very grounding. So whatever your practice is with getting out in nature, you want to do that. Therapy, journaling can be really helpful, whether you're talking to a therapist or journaling your thoughts. Laughter is good for the soul, and laughter is a way to release stress from the body. And so watching something that's funny or having a conversation with someone that makes you laugh is really helpful. And then you will notice immediately after that process that you typically feel better right away. A massage can also be a helpful way to release the tension that our bodies hold and to begin to help the body relax and begin to restore. Getting adequate sleep is so important, because insomnia or a lack of sleep actually is a stress a stressor to the body. And so if you go too long without getting adequate sleep, there's a ton of side effects that you'll probably begin to feel. But it's so important to make sure that you are getting sleep, because again, that causes stress to the body. Affection. So this could be like rubbing a pet, petting your cat or your dog. That can be a form of affection. Maybe a grandchild, or a partner. Like any sort of like long embracing hug is also really helpful. And then the last one is creative expression. And that's just like any sort of art or creative thing that you can do. It can be listening to music, making music. If you enjoy painting or drawing, like any of those sorts of creative outlets are helpful ways to release stress from the body. So before I close out, I want to ask you, what do you notice about this list? When you look at all of the things here, what do you notice? I'll give you the answer. Most of these are focusing on the body. So you don't know that I didn't tell you to go to brunch, or I didn't tell you to go get your nails done or go get your hair done. Like when we think about self-care, we oftentimes think about those very like topical things that make us look really great, right? They're awesome. But these are things that are focused on the body, because the body is what holds the stress and trauma. So I'm not saying that, you shouldn't go get your hair done or your nails done, but outside of that, you have to focus on these physical things, these things that are more body focused, because again, the body holds the stress. All right, so I'm going to leave you with this personal care action plan. And again, getting information is great, but if you don't do anything with it and you just go back to living your life and being super stressed and overwhelmed, it's not so great for your health. And so what I want you to think about is just how you can begin to cultivate more mind body awareness. And so what that means is, how can you begin to pause and listen to your body more, so that when it does communicate that it's stress, you can focus on completing those cycles. And then just what does it look like to prioritize yourself? And so I will drop the link for this personal care action plan, and you can spend some time thinking about what it means to pour into yourself in all of these ways, and maybe who are people that you can rely on to support you in these actions as well. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip the questions, but if you do have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. This is my contact information, so you can always reach out via email. My podcast is listed here. And then I recently finished a book. I know when Melissa was reading my bio, it was saying it will be released, but I wrote a book that talks more heavily into all of the things that I shared today. This was like a very brief introduction. And so the book is called Hold Space to Heal. It's on Amazon and my website. And I also have a card deck that is focused on ways that you can nourish yourself every single day. And the activities range from 3 to 30 minutes. So I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa now. I will drop these resources in the chat for you to have them. And then my last ask for you is, please provide feedback on today's workshop by just scanning that QR code or clicking the link that's in the chat. It's always helpful just to hear your feedback, to let me know what was helpful, maybe what wasn't helpful, things of that nature. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. I know this is a lot of information.
This was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. I know we're at time, and thanks for sharing your contact information. I'm sure others may want to reach out to you after the presentation today. And I know there was so much going on in the chat during the time as well. But again, thank you so much. Hopefully we all feel a little bit more relaxed now. So I do. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for having me, Melissa. And thank you for everyone that tuned in today. Oh, thank you, Gloria, so much. I hope that this was helpful. Maybe you learned one new thing. I hope that it was helpful for you. And then again, there's some resources and links in the chat just for further learning, further support, and the action plan.
Thank you so much.